We've been seeing ongoing ICE enforcement action in our neighborhoods and nationally. Members of our communities are fearful of going to work, sending children to school, or even leaving their homes. In light of officials who disregard legal and constitutional protections, what can we as allies do? We're very fortunate tonight to have Mr. Diego Alcala Laboy from Albany Law School and Ms. Haley Powers from the Columbia County Sanctuary Movement with us to present Immigration Law 101, the rights of individuals, the rights of allies, and the status of actions currently proceeding through the courts. Mr. Laboy is an assistant professor of law at Albany Law School and previously practiced for 17 years as a public defender and criminal defense attorney. He has provided Know Your Rights training about ICE enforcement actions in the Capital Region and in Puerto Rico. Ms. Powers is the Resettlement Coordinator for the Columbia County Sanctuary Movement and participated in our September 2025 roundtable on immigration issues. So thank you, Diego and Haley, for being with us tonight. We very much appreciate your time and your knowledge on this subject. And for attendees, we are going to hold questions till the end. And at that point, we would ask you to use the raise hand symbol if you have a question you'd like to ask. And then when it's your turn to unmute yourself. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Diego and Haley.
Thank you very much, Mary, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. When I got the invitation, I was very excited because it is a topic that I'm very passionate about, but I'd like to do this in community. That's why I invited Haley over because we are basically like a little tag team going all over the area, instructing and just educating folks as to what are the protections that are out there that we currently have and what can we as a community do. As you mentioned, I am an assistant professor. My background is criminal law, which is integral because we will be discussing certain things such as the Constitution. We'll also look very briefly as to some potential criminal exposure as to what people may or may not be charged in these raids, not necessarily the immigrants that are getting picked up, but more importantly, members of the community. If we can
Mm.
or imagine a situation in which the DOJ becomes very aggressive. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about potential charges and what is it exactly, what do they mean? Because it's not the same thing to read something or hear something versus just understanding what exactly it is. And then Haley, I'll switch it over to you so you can just walk us through your section of the presentation.
Awesome. Thank you. And yes, this is always so wonderful to be able to do with Diego. I feel like every time I do this presentation, I learn something new. So definitely recommend if the opportunity presents itself, checking it out again, and seeing what else you can pick up. So today we're going to do kind of a very quick run through of what we call our protocol trainings. So our protocol trainings are based off of a document that was released by the New York Attorney General's office that advised businesses on how to prepare themselves in the event that immigration enforcement came to their place of work in both a scenario like I-9s, but also as a raid. So we'll do a very quick run through of it, a little bit of a know your rights. If you are interested in doing the full training, we're actually going to be doing this again on April 27th. So I'm happy to give Mary the information about that later on.
You ready
Yeah.
to open the PowerPoint, Haley?
Yes.
Okay, 1 second. Okay.
Thank you, David. You
Sure.
can hop right to the next slide.
Okay, where's the? Okay.
Bottom left. Yep.
Okay.
So, to start off the presentation, I am not a lawyer. Diego is a lawyer. I am not a lawyer. Sometimes you might have questions for me that I'm not able to answer. I'll probably defer them over to Diego. But also at the same time, this presentation is mainly meant for educational purposes. So it isn't creating any sort of legal relationship between you all as attendees, us as CCSM, or Diego as well. So please don't take anything necessarily today as legal advice or creating any sort of legal relationship. I'd say if you have very specific questions, you might be able to talk to Diego at a separate time. I'll let him decide that. Or also find another lawyer, CCSM. We have a lot that we like to refer folks to that are immigration attorneys. So our office line is at the bottom of the slide. And then the one in red is our emergency hotline. So I would direct any inquiries, questions to our office line. Next slide. So just really quickly, acknowledgements. We built this presentation with a very wide range of different resources. In addition to Diego contributing all of his knowledge, we've also used resources from National Employment Law Project, Human Services Council, a wide variety you can see here on the screen. So I want to make sure we thank everybody for their contributions. Next. So, in case anybody isn't familiar with who we are at CCSM, CCSM stands for Columbia County Sanctuary Movement. We organize with both immigrants and allies, regardless of immigration status, to collectively support, empower, and defend all of our community because it takes all of us to do it together. We have a wider range of services. We do direct service provision to folks, again, of any immigrant background. We host trainings like this one and webinars for people who are both directly impacted and allies. And we connect everybody with resources where we can. Next slide. So today, as Diego mentioned, we'll just briefly talk about the pieces of the protocol. We'll make sure that you all are well informed about your rights, and then open up for any questions at the end. And I believe next slide is the agenda. We can just skip that and go right to Diego.
Okay.
Yeah, next slide. Everyone knows me already. It's a pleasure to be here again. Haley, thank you very much. So while I'll be talking, we'll just flip over certain slides. And what I wanted to present at the beginning is just an understanding of the historical nature of how ICE has been operating in the United States, not Asian history, but more recent history. So under Obama, for those who may not know, um, people in the immigration community and Latino community specifically were aware of his efforts to increase deportations. He did earn the moniker of deporter in chief. But when the Trump 1 administration came into power, those actions were actually sped up. After the first Trump administration, with Biden's new administration coming in, um, we see how in 2011, I'm sorry, and then again with the
Sure.
Democratic administration, that's fine, you can leave there.
Okay.
Um, the Democratic administrations were a little bit more sensitive as to where ICE would be operating. So the ability of ICE to interfere with a person primarily stems from their responsibility to enforce immigration law. And in order to for an agent to actually arrest someone, they need to have probable cause that the person is believed to be in the country without the proper documentation. Well, those enforcement actions under the Trump administration, Trump 1.0, primarily were done everywhere. With the Biden administration, there was a new protocol in place in which the administration placed some safeguards and use its discretion to limit the enforcement actions. More specifically, it didn't allow ICE to perform their normal functions at hospitals, education institutions, places of worships, which included religious ceremonies, and other affiliated or collateral services from a religious institution, and or whenever a person was exercising their First Amendment rights, such as participation in protest. Of course, those limitations would not include or expand in case there was a judicial warrant, and we'll show you that a little bit later on. If there is a judicial warrant, an arrest warrant that's signed by a magistrate, that is a legal warrant, and the officers do have the authority to then enter these what they were considered sensitive locations. Um, the interpretation as to what classified it was a very expansive definition. So the discretion was used in order to protect these locations and immigrants that were pretty much dependent on living right in a community. Therefore, going to school is part of it, getting sick and going to the hospital is part of it, such as participating in services, religious services. And it is an understanding that there was a chilling effect that was making people very scared. And I think we can see that happening all over again. We can go to the next slide. So as I said, when the new Trump administration came up, the most recent in 2025, these limitations were removed. We can go to the next slide. And once they were removed, we saw a bunch of enforcement actions being occurring in multiple locations because of the information, because of this um, presentation primarily is religious based. We wanted to highlight that even though these protections were discretionary, right, that we're protecting locations, what they were considered sensitive locations, federal law has something called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and primarily bars the federal government on placing a substantial burden on the exercise of religion, right? So under a constitutional review, the government must have a really high bar in order to justify something that would affect religious service. And what I mean by religious service, again, it is an expansive definition. So it's not just, for example, a mass, it's also any other ceremony associated, which it would include, let's say you guys have a food pantry or you have a education component, right? Teaching English within this the premises, or a program that would include taking your church members, bringing them to the church because they don't have enough transportation. So you're transporting folks, right? These type of services are included in the definition of what Religious Freedom Restoration Act tries to protect. And at the beginning of the administration, there was a case, the Quakers versus Trump, and there was a second case actually that was brought by a local church in which they were able to stop the Trump administration, especially ICE, from operating or enforcing their enforcement actions and limiting that discretion based on this Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Unfortunately, it was not a nationwide injunction, but it is an avenue that has been utilized successfully in order to protect the location and the members of that religious community. Next slide, please. Now, if we step away from that particular statute that provides us with some protections, we want to recognize that the Constitution of the United States presents a lot of the protections that are relevant in the enforcement of immigration law. Even though it's not necessarily thought of something that happens in immigration, the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution, which you can see the language right there, the right of the people to be secure, their persons, houses, and papers. Basically, you can't really search without it being reasonable, the search and seizure clause of the Fourth Amendment, right? And it also includes a second portion of it, which is the warrant requirement, right? So the Fourth Amendment is applicable not only in the criminal context, but in the civil context. And it is not just for criminal purposes. So, for example, it is applicable whenever a state agent acts. So that could include a hospital, include a prison setting, it could include an airport. So as you can see, these are functions that are not traditionally operated by the police or law enforcement, but yet the Fourth Amendment and its functions do apply in this case. Now, next slide, please. What does the Fourth Amendment really protect? So, under the development of court opinions, we have two distinct doctrines that have been developed to help us understand the scope of the protections. The first one is called the trespass doctrine, and this was a 1923 case in which the court recognized that a owner of a property may have their Fourth Amendment rights violated by a government if the government encroaches onto that property, right? So if there's a trespass, as they called it, onto someone's property, that individual, by the trespass itself, may have a right or a claim against the government. And that's important if we consider your community and a religious community as the owners of the location in which you're in, right? So that's the first thing that we can recognize. If there is an encroachment onto that right of entering your property without proper authorization, in theory, the Fourth Amendment should be able to protect the owner of that location. The second important doctrine under the Fourth Amendment and ways in which we protect ourselves is under the reasonable expectation of privacy test. And this is a 1950 case in which the famous case US versus Katz, in which this guy was calling his bookie. And he was calling his bookie, and instead of calling from his hotel, he decided to go outside into a phone booth. And it's funny because I tell this story and we read this case recently in my law school classes, and I still have to explain to these students what a phone booth is. So I put pictures, and because I have no idea what that is. So Harry Potter, maybe if they're a little bit older, Superman, that's not a reference they get, but we all do. So the Superman booth, right? This Mr. Katz goes into the booth, closes the booth behind him, and the FBI was listening, right? So the FBI, understanding that they couldn't trespass, decides to put their wiretap on top of the booth, not touching the booth itself. And in that case, surprisingly, the court understood that the protections afforded under the Fourth Amendment are for people. And if people sort of expect that their conversations are not going to be heard by the government, it's not limited to inside your home, but also outside your home. So the court developed a reasonable expectation of privacy test, which requires what did this person do to ensure his privacy. So if you're in a phone booth, a normal person would close the door behind them and talk in a normal way, not scream, right? In that case, that's the subjective element. And then there's a second part of the analysis in which the court has to ask, is society ready to recognize that what this person did is actually to protect privacy? So if we take that and we extrapolate it into hundreds of scenarios, we can imagine someone that you are walking in a mall with, and you see someone walking with their cell phone on speaker, right? If they were on speakerphone and you can hear that conversation, well, we may recognize a protection on phone calls, but once that person does not protect their own privacy, then he cannot claim a privacy violation, because if it's out in public, you're not protecting it. It's fair game, and that also applies, right, to other like finding of contraband and stuff. So we can go on to the next slide. So under the Fourth Amendment, that is primarily to protect us from encroachments and activity. So if I can actually go back before we see this slide, I wanted to finish up. I recognize that I may have missed something, but either way, you don't need to move back. What I wanted to say about the Fourth Amendment primarily is the fact that in order for agents to go into a home, they cannot do it without a proper authorization. And what proper authorization is the ability of what the Fourth Amendment says, um, that it allows for a law enforcement to go into the home only if they have a judicial warrant. Now, a judicial warrant is different from an administrative warrant. And again, we can see those a little bit later on. We'll show you the distinctions. But with an official warrant of an arrest, the government does have the authority to go in, right? Without it, the property owner and the people inside of it still have a protection. Similarly, although there's a lesser privacy protection when you are out in public or when you are in a vehicle, you still have those protections. Okay. In the immigration context, unfortunately, immigrants do not have a right to contest their arrest unless the arrest is a significant deviation of what justice means, right? So it is a little bit more difficult to argue these protections in the immigration setting. But that does not mean that these rights are evaporated, right? They are there, and we continue to document what we see in order to help these members of our communities who may be picked up if there are egregious conducts being effectuated by these officers. We can use that in order to help their case. Another section of the Constitution that helps is the right to counsel and the right to remain silent. Typically, when immigration agents happen to enter a location looking for people, they do not stop with just one person. They usually seize or try to stop as many as possible. And what happens is that during those interactions, an agent may ask that individual multiple questions. Agents may not have any information on this person that they stopped. And through that back and forth, the individual that has been seized may actually inadvertently provide all the material the agent needs in order to justify their departure, their deportation. So in this context, whenever a person is under arrest or in custody, they're being asked questions by the government, and that those questions may hurt them criminally or civilly, or in this case, administratively through the immigration proceedings, the person has a right to remain silent. That means that the government cannot force them to answer those questions without first having an attorney present. So the person who is detained, and I think there's a link to what we call the red card, which is a card that informs agents by the immigrant and tells them what they want, which is, I want to exercise my right to remain silent, and I want to ask for an attorney. And those protections do exist and are also applicable in the context of immigration detention. Next slide, please. Now, this is the scene that is at the beginning of the immigration raids in New York City. But primarily, we have seen a lot of pushback from civil society to these type of interactions between agents and community members. Luckily, I wanted to add, we have seen a lot of pushback. So it is important to recognize that during these enforcement actions, a lot of people may want to jump in and help out, right? So one of the things that we want to highlight is what is the typical problem with participating in an action which may be deemed or considered by DOJ or ICE specifically, I'm going to charge you with a crime, right? So the first section that I wanted to discuss is the one that's probably the most used section of the criminal code, actually immigration code, which is called harboring a certain alien. And primarily, it's very simple. It's either you are bringing in, transporting aliens, undocumented immigrants into the country, or you're moving them from one location to the other for the purposes of avoiding detection by immigration agents, or if you're shielding or harboring or concealing them, again, for the purposes of ensuring that ICE does not get them, and you know, right, that they are being tracked down. And finally, the encouraging or inducing an alien to enter. Those are primarily what constitutes the crime of harboring certain aliens. You also have other crimes which would expand liability, such as a conspiracy statute and aiding and abetting, and that's just a way for them to charge more people under these statutes. If we can go ahead to the next slide, please. So that's the statute. I put it up there just because it looks scary, but it isn't. Next slide. And we can break it down. So bringing in an undocumented person, I'm from Puerto Rico, and this is what we usually have. We have Dominicans and others coming in through boats that are very typical to this. This is a boat called Ayola, and it's probably 30 to 50 people per trip that usually comes over. And this is what they're trying to prosecute. The captain of this boat is the one committing the offense, and those who help the captain. So whenever bringing an alien in is thrown around, this is the type of thing that they're trying to avoid. I want to highlight that the United States had a long history with slavery, and there was a federal law that required northern states to return slaves to the South. So this is a new version of what that old history is. Just when you think about these crimes, think about it in those terms, and it will make a little bit more sense. Next slide, please. In the context of transporting aliens, we may think that our community has, I don't know, a service which transports our congregation kids from point A to point B. Does this statute affect them? The answer is no. The purpose of this statute is, as if you can see the first picture on top, is to avoid situations in which immigrants are being moved from one location to another for the purposes of avoiding capture. The one in the bottom is your typical church congregation church that you may see taking kids to camp or taking um, other members of the community around to whatever services are offered by the church. The purpose here, again, is that if you're transporting them, it's for the purpose other than escape or avoiding detection. Without that, then this statute does not apply. We can go to the next slide. This picture is actually, these two pictures are from Arizona. Back in the early 2020s, these individuals were placing water bottles all over the desert. And the purpose of this is to avoid immigrants who were coming in through the Arizona border, that they would have at least some food and water along the way, ensuring that people would not die during this trek. The federal government arrested this group of people and decided to charge them with harboring or concealing undocumented immigrants. And again, in that case, even though the charges went forward, the jury acquitted these activists. But the purpose against here is to provide them with resources in their efforts to hide themselves from the federal government. And you can only be charged by that if, for example, they know that you're hiding them and that you know that they're being looked for. Next slide, please. And the final one is meant to deter. And I would say that you can see scams online in which they're recruiting au pairs or babysitters or some sort of other females promising them jobs. And then once the person arrives, the immigrant's passport and documentation is taken away. And then that person is probably becoming a victim of human trafficking. So the purpose of this statute is to ensure that these type of incidents do not occur. Next slide, please. We can skip conspiracy and we can skip aiding and abetting. And as I said, it's just a matter of increasing the group of people that can get prosecuted for this statute. Yep, next slide. Yep, next slide.
Okay.
And these are the sentencing guidelines, and there's no way we're going to do this today, but ultimately, even though you may have seen in the presentation that these charges have a maximum of 5 years, let's say I get arrested for one of these things, I don't have any criminal record, and I'm charged for helping 5 immigrants. The court will then use the federal sentencing guidelines to determine my actual criminal exposure. And in my particular case, without any particular crime or any particular criminal background, I would be facing 0 to 6 months of incarceration. Although the statute says one thing, This sentencing guidelines is what we need to, as a federal defense attorney, to look at to examine correctly what the exposure is. So when we hear these, oh my God, the person is facing X amount of years, we always want to remember that that's what the statute and the maximum penalty may be, but that's not necessarily what's applicable to your case. Thank you. Next slide. Another famous or mostly used crime right now. You may recall there was a case in DC in which an individual threw a Subway sandwich against ICE agents and he was charged with obstruction of justice. It's the intentional impeding of the legal actions of an immigration officer. That crime is routinely charged, but very rarely in the past year has been able to stick because the people are getting picked up for exercising their right to First Amendment right to record and protest. There's another crime called lying to a federal agent and identity theft. Those are two different crimes, and those are primarily going to be used most likely against people that do not have documentation, proper documentation, and they use a fake ID. That's identity theft, and that's a 2-year minimum crime. And then lying to a federal agent, right, would also trigger some sort of criminal penalty. Next slide, please. So that's my section right now, and I'm going to pass it over to Haley. We'll skip the questions until the end, and I'm more than happy to help out. Thank you.
Thank you, Diego. So we'll get through as much of the protocol section as we can. And again, we're doing this presentation a second time, April 27th. So if we aren't able to make it all, I'll send the details about that. So next slide. So the development of what we call law enforcement intervention protocol, we expanded to all law enforcement because with this administration, it is no longer just ICE or the Department of Homeland Security that are tasked with immigration enforcement. So we expanded to all law enforcement intervention protocol. It comes with a couple of different steps. And so we'll go into each one kind of briefly, but this is essentially the overview of what goes into a protocol in general. So next slide, please. So to start with, when you develop a protocol for your community of faith, your place of worship, if you own a business, a nonprofit, you're going to want to look at the different people within your group and think about what sort of roles and responsibilities might fit them well in the event that law enforcement shows up to your place of worship. So first and foremost, you're going to want to have somebody who is responsible for developing the entirety of the protocol. That's probably the person who's in charge of your place of worship. But then there are some other areas that you'll want to consider as well. So things like who is allowed to speak to law enforcement. Again, typically this will be somebody who is at the very top of the structure of your place of worship, the, again, person in charge. But it could be other people as well. For example, if you have a receptionist, this person should be trained on how to speak to law enforcement. We recommend anybody who is responsible speaking with law enforcement to undergo know your rights training, conflict de-escalation training, just so that they feel more comfortable in talking with law enforcement. Some other areas that you'll want to consider are who is going to inform either employees, if you have any vulnerable employees, any congregation members, if you have vulnerable congregation members, who is the person that is going to be responsible for letting them know that there is law enforcement on the premises. This is a very good role for somebody who is bilingual, if you have a lot of bilingual individuals coming to your place of worship. You're also going to want to think about how you communicate that. Email is not always the fastest way to reach out to people. At CCSM, we use Signal. But it could be a variety of different options. You just have to kind of look at what works best for you and your constituents in order to get the information out the fastest that people probably shouldn't come to the service that day because law enforcement is there. Again, if you have vulnerable employees and ICE or another DHS agency is there for a special I-9 check, which we won't talk about today, who's going to be compiling any sort of documents? Do you have an immigration attorney either on file or that you know of that you can call? And if so, who is going to be the person to contact the immigration attorney? Because it's always good to have that be either the first or second step after calling your local rapid response network. And then finally, who will be recording the encounter? This is a really important task. I like to think of it similar to if you're in an actual emergency and you need to call 911, you're supposed to look at somebody directly and say, "You please call 911," so that you know it is getting done. Recording the encounter is incredibly important in order to help the person who is being or persons who are being detained. It helps us to identify them if, for whatever reason, we're unable to do so. And it also gives us something to help keep law enforcement agents accountable in the event that they do something egregious, as Diego mentioned earlier on. Some things that you also might want to keep in mind are if media reaches out to you, if the news of a raid gets out to the public and media reaches out, do you want to have a policy to speak with them? If so, who should be doing that? And it might be good to kind of have an idea of what you're going to say in advance so that it doesn't come as a surprise after a raid happens. If media don't reach out to you, are you in a situation where you would like to inform media that this is happening to raise awareness about, this issue that is, really affecting our communities? And then finally, who is going to be responsible for what we call a post-raid process? This includes the sorts of things that you're going to want to do to help the detained individuals or their families. So next slide, please. So again, when you create this law enforcement intervention plan, you're going to want to make sure that all staff, all congregants who are participating are aware of the plan, they're trained on the plan, they are okay with their role if law enforcement does show up. You're going to want to know where everybody is at certain times of the day. So, for example, if you have one particular mass where you know most of your vulnerable community members attend, it's good to know when that happens and who is going to be there so that you can easily react if law enforcement shows up early on. Again, as I mentioned, setting up communications, not just with any sort of staff that you have, but also, again, your congregation. So, how are you going to communicate out that law enforcement is there, both to people who are not there yet, but also to people who are on the premises? You're going to want to emphasize that they shouldn't run because that could alarm the agents and give them probable cause that there is a crime being committed. And these are all bits of trainings that, again, you're going to want to be giving both your staff and your congregation. CCSM, we do trainings that talk about this, and we're happy to talk with anybody about doing more in-depth trainings for your specific place of worship. Next, please. So yes, again, you're going to want to set a plan up so that you can communicate and then communicate out with media as well. Next slide. Just as important as it is to train your congregation, to train your staff, and make sure that everybody is aware of the plan, it's also equally important to make sure that the plan is accessible. So put it in places where people who might have to access it regularly can get to it quite easily. So again, if you have a receptionist, you might want to have it on the side of the door, the back of the door. That's where we have it in our office, is on the back of our door. Also, if you have community members and staff members who are bilingual, again, you might want to consider translating the plan into whatever languages are present in your congregation. And again, practice this ahead of time. It's just like any other emergency. Think of it perhaps like a fire drill. Practice scenarios of immigration enforcement agencies coming to your place of worship. What do you do and how do you react? It's easier to react in the moment once you've had the time to practice than it is to just uh, do it when they show up. It can be a little scary. All right, next one. In addition to roles and responsibilities, you're going to want to very clearly demarcate any sort of private spaces that are located within your place of worship. So these could include an office. It could include if you have dormitories on your premises. So if you are providing sanctuary to people, making sure that those are very clearly demarcated as private. If you have employees, again, that you're providing housing to, that's very important. An office space, because this is very clearly telling law enforcement that they are not allowed to enter what is, again, a space of reasonable expectation of privacy. So, as Diego said, they will need a warrant to come into a private space, but that doesn't always necessarily mean that they will or that they will respect that. So making sure to have extra signage is just incredibly helpful on the back end to protect yourself. Next slide, please. So if you have vulnerable community members within your congregation, you might want to consider helping them create what we call a family preparedness plan. This is a plan that helps them put all their affairs in order. This includes children, who's going to pick them up from school. It can include pets. It could include car payments, picking up payments from work. There's all sorts of things that go into creating a family preparedness plan, but essentially it boils down to what this individual would like to happen in the event that they get detained and or deported, so that anything in their life is taken care of. There are a lot of community nonprofits and community groups that have their own family preparedness plan. We have one at CCSM. So, feel free to reach out to your local NGO or community group to see if they would be willing to help you do this with your congregation. Additionally, there are some consulates who also do this service for their community members. I think the Mexican consulate does this. So it also might be beneficial to inform your congregation to look into whatever country consulate they would belong to and see if this is a service that they can get from the consulate. Next slide, please. So again, talking about the post-raid plan, this is something that's really important to talk about in advance and set up in advance so that you don't really necessarily have to think about it once a raid is finished. And you can kind of just start rolling it out. So things that you might want to consider in a post-raid service are, do you as a faith community want to or have the ability to provide legal support for any employees, congregants, their family members? Can you help financially contribute to them for things such as legal support or bond to help them post bond? If this is something that you're interested in, able to do, what does that look like? How can you set that up now to help people afterwards? Other things to think about are, can we contribute to their commissary or their phone accounts? Sometimes when community members are detained, it can be quite hard to find them in the system once they're detained. One of the ways that their family members can find out where they are is through some of these commissary companies. That's one of the ways we find people once they've been detained. So it's very helpful to be able to put money into their commissary. They can call their family. So this is something to consider. Again, if you're providing sanctuary, if you have employees that are on your premises, if one family member gets detained, how are you going to support the rest of the family? Are you going to keep them, or are you going to allow them to continue staying in your place of worship? If that's not going to be possible, maybe trying to figure out in advance different pathways that you might be able to direct them to, different services that they might take advantage of if someone is detained. Also, it's really important to know what your local mutual aid and nonprofit and support groups are. There are quite a few in our area, and they always seem to be popping up, which is really wonderful. But they all do all sorts of different things. In Albany, you have Capital Region Sanctuary Coalition. They work in Albany and Rensselaer counties, but are also connected to groups in Saratoga County. Um, Columbia County Sanctuary Movement, we operate primarily in Columbia and Greene counties, but also work a little bit in Northern Dutchess. There's Basic, which is out in the Berkshires. There's groups down closer towards Poughkeepsie. Definitely take a look, see what your local group is, see what their rapid response protocols are, and make sure that you know this and are including this in your plan. Next one. So as I've been mentioning somewhat regularly, you're going to want to make sure people are trained on this. And if a raid happens and you realize that some of the pieces of your plan don't work, and you make changes to your plan, you're going to want to make sure that everybody has been trained and kept up to date on what the new plan is. The new plan is made accessible for everybody. So some of the things besides just the plan itself that you're going to want to make sure people are trained up on are knowing what ICE looks like. CCSM, we call that a salute training. So being able to identify the different agencies within the Department of Homeland Security and agencies that are tasked with assisting them. How can you identify them? And once identified, and how can you report a raid to your local rapid response hotline so that we can respond in a more timely fashion? So we run that training every couple of weeks. And you're also going to want to train folks up on the basics of a Know Your Rights training. And again, we aren't the only ones that do these trainings. NYIC does them, New York Immigration Coalition. There's a whole slew of others. So please feel free to reach out, and we can definitely point you into the direction of what organizations might be doing this sooner than us, for example. Okay, so next slide. Next slide again. So we have like 10 more minutes before we wanted to jump to questions. So I wanted to kind of just touch base very quickly on a very basic Know Your Rights. I've taken out the identifying warrant section, but we have a warrant packet that I will make sure to send to you, Mary, that you can share out with everybody. It's incredibly helpful. I keep it on me, and I know a lot of our volunteers do as well, so that we can identify more confidently in the moment what a judicial warrant looks like opposed to an administrative warrant. So I'll make sure to send those out and you can refer to those. First and foremost, everybody, regardless of their immigration status, always has the right to speak to an attorney. You always have the right to remain silent, I believe, except for when you're presenting your driver's license to a police officer if you have been pulled over. And you have the right as the owner of a car, a business, a private residence to refuse an illegal search and seizure. Again, of course, with the exception of whether or not the officer present has a legal judicial warrant or probable cause. Next slide, please. So in order for any officer, it doesn't need to be immigration officers specifically, to enter into a private space and to arrest an individual, there are a couple primary pathways for them to do this. So, as we've been saying over and over, the first one is a judicial arrest warrant or a judicial search and seizure warrant that's been signed by a judge. If they do not have a judicial warrant, which more than often they will not, they'll try to present you with an administrative warrant and convince you that it's a judicial warrant. If they do not have this, they'll need the permission of the owner of the vehicle, of the private residence, of the business, of the church, or what have you, to enter into the space. That's why we say be very careful when, for example, answering the door. Um, uh, if for whatever reason you are thinking there is a possibility of an agent showing up to your place of business or your home, try to make sure that you are able to see who is outside without having to open up the door because they can, A, take that as an invitation that you are giving them permission, but also it makes it a little bit easier for them to use force and then force themselves into the car or residence. If you have not given permission, the other two ways an officer can enter into a private space is if they believe there's an ongoing emergency situation. So, for example, if you open the door, but you have a screen door or a storm door, so you're not fully opening the door, but they can see into the residence. And they can see that there's somebody lying down on the floor. It could be taken that this is an ongoing emergency situation. Additionally, if they believe that there is a crime that is ongoing and being committed, for example, again, if you've opened the door and they can see into the residence and somebody is running out the back or into another room, they could use this as probable cause that there's a crime being committed, and that would allow them entry into a private space. Next slide, please. So during a raid, as I've mentioned a little bit earlier, make sure to encourage people not to run, because as I mentioned before, they could take that as a sign that a crime is being committed. So make sure everybody knows, do not run. Calmly walk to a space where there is a closed door or a private sign, something that's puts space or something solid between the individual and the officers. Um, Anybody who hasn't been authorized to speak to law enforcement should either remain silent or say, I choose to remain silent. Please speak with my employer, this individual who has been told they are authorized to speak to law enforcement. And you can just keep repeating it over and over. I choose to remain silent. Don't say anything at all. Um, Staff and congregation should not confirm or deny that any specific person is either a member of the congregation, is staff at the at your church or synagogue or what have you. Again, just keep silent is probably the better way to do it. Diego?
I wanted to add that this is a really important thing because you could be charged with lying to a lying to a federal officer if you decide to do something other than exercising your right to remain silent. That is not a crime. Saying I choose to remain silent, it's not a crime. So they cannot get any information and you would not be subject to any penalties if that's the case. So just wanted to highlight how important that is.
Yes. And so, in addition to not confirming or denying any person is there, don't offer any questions or information to an officer as well. Again, better to just stay silent. Um, next slide. Next slide, please. Sorry. One more. One more slide over. We'll
One more?
just
Okay.
end on filming the encounter. Yeah. Yep,
Another slide?
yes.
Okay. Okay.
So as I mentioned earlier, it's really important to have somebody filming the encounter. It is legal in New York State to film without the consent of the other party unless you are on federal property. But it is also always a good idea to kind of just make it a little bit obvious that you are filming a raid. This is for rapid response purposes. Often it's like shaming, and it might be a helpful deterrent in getting the agents to leave. But when you are filming an encounter, you want to make sure to film the agents, try to get their badge numbers, their names, what are they wearing. If you're outside and able to, what are they driving? Do they have guns on them? Take as much photo and video as you can, but don't publish it to any sort of social media. Send it immediately to your local rapid response network. We have the capacity to blur out the faces of anybody who is vulnerable, that is being detained. But we want the raw video so that, again, if we have to find an individual, it's helpful for us to identifying who that is. We have a super helpful website that goes into the intricacies of filming an encounter with law enforcement. So I'll make sure to send that as well as the warrant packet. But definitely really important to have people filming and taking video. And final slide. Next one. So here is the CCSM hotline. It's available 24/7. We have multiple people that are on the line. They speak both Spanish and English. Our rapid response hotline takes texts. You can call, you can send video, you can send photos. We recommend you send all of it, as much as you can to help us identify individuals. And again, there are so many different rapid response networks that are existing or popping up. We work with most of them. So if you aren't sure who your local rapid response network is, please feel free to reach out, not to this number because this is the emergency number, but our office line is on our website. And it is again on the first or second slide of the slide deck, which I think you'll be receiving. We are more than happy to help you identify what your local rapid response network is. But we definitely recommend that everybody still kind of put our hotline in if you're in the vicinity of the capital region. Because if you report to us something that's happening in Albany, for example, we can still get it to the Albany Rapid Response Network, CRSC. So we're all chatting, we're all talking, we all are connected, and are able to share information quite quickly. So I will stop here, and just to make sure that we have enough time for questions.
Full stop sharing.
Yes, yep, that's fine.
Yep.
But again, the full slide presentation we'll be doing on April 27th. So I will stop here and pass it back to you, Mary.
Okay.
Thank you, Haley. Thank you, Diego. I see one question in the chat from Kathleen. Can we address what changes in the law are being considered by the Congress?
Okay, so I'm not sure specifically in reference to what, but we do know that the big beautiful bill that was passed in the last year of Congress session increased budget by $20 billion to DHS. A lot of it is being spent in purchasing warehouses by ICE and DHS in order to store humans. This is happening in many communities throughout the United States. And that is one thing that's happening. In addition to that, we know that there are significant investments in advanced surveillance technologies that are being used by ICE. In combination, for example, there's a company called Palantir, which was used in the Afghan and Iraq wars in order to identify terrorists. That's being deployed within the local population, utilizing documentation from the IRS, Human Health Services, and other government agencies who have illegally transported and passed over that information to this particular company in order for to help them identify people that they believe are not in the country legally. As far as Congress, we do know that there was, and there is still an ongoing shutdown threat with the Department of Homeland Security. It has been modified. That's why we saw the big lines during this past month at the airports, in which, because at the current moment, TSA agents, which falls within the umbrella of DHS, are not being paid. It wasn't until 3 weeks ago that the Trump administration signed an executive order authorizing payments. Through that battle, budget battle, the Democrats have been insisting on implementing reforms to the execution and the way ICE is operating. Specifically, they're not adding anything new other than making sure the ICE agents do not have any masks on and limiting the enforcement activities and entering private spaces only in the instance of a judicial warrant. So that's primarily the ones I know. I'm sure that there may be others, but I'm not fluent enough in everything immigration. But I'm happy to try to answer more specifics if I could get a little bit more information as to what specifically is being asked.
Colleen, do you want to follow up? To unmute yourself.
I think there are a couple questions in the chat, Mary.
Yeah, we'll move along.
Okay.
A question from Ruth. How can I contact you in person? Diego, do you have contact information you can share?
Yeah, Mary can share my email address. That's the best way to get me. And then we can set up a Zoom meeting at some point. I do travel a lot to Puerto Rico. My entire family's down there, but I'm more than happy to meet online. That's the fastest way. I'm always drinking coffee, so invite me a coffee. And I mean, it could cost you, but because I'll be drinking a lot of it, but I'm also available.
Thank you. Question, have there been incidents in the Capital District where ICE agents have entered places of worship?
Haley, you have any information on that?
I don't have specifics, but I believe there has been one incident. Um, I don't know if they necessarily entered the place of worship, but it was connected to a church. There was another incident actually, as I'm thinking about it as well. They placed agents outside of a mosque after Sunday prayer or Friday prayer and picked people up as they were coming out of the mosque. So I don't know if it's they've entered specifically, but I do know that they have been setting themselves up outside of specific places of worship and picking up individuals that way.
Another question, after Trump, do people have hope to get Social Security numbers and work papers? And is there hope for people here now?
Well, one of the problems that we're seeing is that the federal government has been downsizing, and that has created an enormous backlog in the immigration space. So, assuming that a person has come in through the proper channels, if their case would take 4 years, we're talking now about 8 to 10 years of review processes. Not only that, the Trump administration has imposed re-reviews of authorized visas and authorized permits. So they have the ability to go back and review if you posted something on social media that the particular person reviewing doesn't like, it could cost you again your authorization. On top of that, we have new restrictions as to who can come in and who can ask. And for example, if you wanted to have a work visa now, your price would go up significantly in order to get those work visas. There was a big scandal because the office in charge, the USCIC, of the review process admitted of taking money and just basically doing nothing for these people who have been in queue properly for a lot of time. So it's problematic what we're seeing, the dismantling of the immigration system, not only on resource power but also On the judicial component, which is an administrative process, who gets to stay and leave, those review processes are attorneys of the DOJ assigned to the immigration courts. Those that do have knowledge of immigration have been purged, and they're bringing in people that are loyal to the particular administration, which also creates a bigger problem for those who believe that the system is working at some point. So yes, there is there hope. There's always hope, but we do have to recognize the difficulties that are purposely being put in place through the current administration.
Diego, we hear on the news, and you always have to be a little suspect, but we hear on the news that US citizens, people who are here with valid green cards and other permits that allowed them to enter this country under previous administrations legally, that they are being detained, but we don't hear whether those cases get cleared, whether they are detained for a long period of time, whether it sounds like their status is graciously changed because the Trump administration has decided that it wants to change it. Is that true? Is that understanding correct? And do those people have any recourse?
Yes, it's true. There has been a significant number of cases in which people that have been authorized to stay in the country, being legally, that includes citizens, have been erroneously picked up by ICE. On occasion, when that occurs, ICE has shoveled them from a particular jurisdiction and places them in places such as Texas and Louisiana. And that
Mm.
is on purpose because judges in those particular jurisdictions often are more leaning towards a conservative or Republican um, purpose, right? So it is true that people are incorrectly being picked up. The problems that we have is not just that, for example, someone who in 1989 may have come in legally and have not yet attained citizenship, but do have a valid documentation to be in the country. The parameters of that particular documentation may change. So, for example, we have very famous cases in which students were being picked up because they were exercising First Amendment rights to protest the genocide that's occurring in Gaza. And when that occurred, the Department of State labeled these students as enemies of the state, basically using an arcane 1923 law in order to expedite their removal. Courts have been able to stop that, but it does not stop the immigration process of reviewing that. So we do have attacks on status on multiple areas. We heard recently in which entire communities that had been provided temporary protective status, known as TPS. The most recent one was the Haitian community, who has had a TPS ongoing since 1993. Salvador also has another TPS, Nicaragua. These are all locations in which people have become refugees because of the war situation in those countries. The United States has provided them special protections. Those protections have been starting to being peeled off by the administration, and up until recently, we heard that the Congress passed again a TPS Authorization Act for the Haitian community. But again, these are attacks on not only the undocumented people and not only people that, according to the administration, are criminals, and the term criminal is now being expanded to any arrest or conviction, which obviously puts brown and black people in a disadvantage no matter what society in the United States. That's always the reality of the criminal process. Um, Exposes them to significant harm if these convictions are actually people are getting deported because they jaywalked 15 years ago or they had some minor offense and then stuff like that are it's being used. But more importantly, they're changing the definition of what legal means. So if we can't get you out because of a conviction, we'll just change the law or the internal administrative matters in order to ensure that you are no longer legal. And then that way we can then proceed with the expedited removal process.
Just to add to that really quickly, something that we're seeing on the end of trying to help people get out post bail, those sorts of things. There's a significant shortage of available immigration attorneys, especially ones that are pro bono. And everybody who is available is incredibly swamped with the amount of cases that they have. So if individuals are detained, especially if they're moved out of New York State, it can be very hard to find somebody to help represent them, to get them out, or even to help them post bail. So this has been, at least for us in the detention support, quite difficult.
Is there anything we can do? I mean, it sounds like it's very difficult for you. It sounds like it is impossible for those of us who aren't in this field. But is there anything we can do?
Of course, we fight back, we resist, we don't let the system eat us. We do what Minnesota did. They stood up and fought and took back their communities against ICE. It did create a lot of awareness, right, across the nation as to what's going on. We can join Haley here and develop programs which would help us protect our community members in ways that are strategic and organized. And I think that one of the things that ICE and the administration is counting on is fear and hopelessness. I think that's important to fight back and try to recognize that ever since the Mayflower landed, people have been resisting this authoritarian and fascist tendencies that sometimes dominate politics in the United States. So there has been examples of many communities in the United States that have been able to successfully fight back. Of course, that requires not a counter reactionary approach and requires, just as Haley mentioned, an organized approach, one that requires solidarity and requires us to get together with others that are also suffering and together then build upon that. And Haley's presentation is just one example of that. I'm sure that within your community, you may or may not have contacts to immigration attorneys, but more importantly, you may not need that because you can help locations with the funding, or you can help in other capacities. So there's a lot of stuff that we can do. The administrations and others just wants us to sit back, look at the news, get mad, and that's it. But we need more. We need to move out of our comfortable lives and get in there, which I know all of you are more than capable and willing to do. Join Haley and other groups that are actually fighting the fight.
Has the parish council had training or have plans for training for St. Vincent's? Excuse me. I have had a Know Your Rights training, and I brought that a summary of that training back to the council. I know Elizabeth has talked with some of the staff about trying to identify some first actions for the event if someone were to approach the parish during a service. I don't know uh, what else might have been put together formally. I think, we've been through a pretty busy time, and I just haven't had a chance to circle back with Elizabeth on this. But certainly with this presentation, it's another opportunity to reopen those discussions. What law enforcement entities in the capital region currently work with ICE? And can and do capital region law enforcement officers work with ICE when they're off duty, even if their department doesn't allow ICE cooperation.
Do you want me to
Yeah.
start? Okay. So we know that in the capital region, there's at least one local police department that has what we call a 287G agreement. This essentially deputizes them as agents of the Department of Homeland Security and allows them to act similarly to ICE, and we know that they have been exercising this within the state. The number of departments who have such agreements is growing. We also know that the FBI is collaborating with ICE and DHS. We have documented collaboration both up in Albany County, but also down in Columbia and Greene County. Um, as of right now, we don't have, I would say, official evidence that state troopers are collaborating, but it's very much not out of the realm of possibilities. I don't know about officers that are off duty, but I think there are or could be several departments that might not yet have an official 287G agreement, but are still assisting with immigration enforcement action. That being said, talking about something that you can do, one of the things that CCSM does is to advocate for legislation that would help members of our community that are quite vulnerable. One of this is New York for All, which would prohibit any New York State police department or law enforcement agency from collaborating with ICE. They've been working really, really hard to pass it. Kathy Hochul is working really, really hard to find a not so great alternative. There's a big action happening tomorrow, but often what the asks are for people to show up, speak to their representatives, call their representatives, just demonstrate how many people across New York State really support the New York for All legislation and stand with our immigrant community members. And this is just one of several different pieces of legislation that are proposed and are currently working through our state legislation. Um, so if you're interested in any of those, again, please feel free to reach out and we can put you in touch because our organizing team is always trying to pass these sorts of positive legislation.
Haley, if you want to send any of that information to me, I can share that. I know people would be willing to reach out and contact their representatives. Is there any other sort of help that you could use? I know when they do know your rights training, they talk about, would you be willing to sign on to an emergency response team? Is that still an ask that's out there?
Yeah, definitely. Having people join our rapid response networks is always an ask because this is going to be a marathon and not a sprint, which sounds a bit cliche, but it is really applicable. It is exhausting, this type of work. So to be able to have a very strong community base to be able to fall back on is always really great. The people who are running the rapid response networks are exhausted. So to be able to have community members that are reliable, helpful, are always there to help out when they can, it is really important. Each rapid response network is built slightly differently. They're not, all the same cookie cutter. There's different areas in which you can contribute. I know Albany, for example, they separate theirs out into the rapid response, care, and education. The care team, for example, is responsible for helping connect families of detained community members to mental health resources, to housing resources if they need it. Often they'll set up GoFundMe's and try to help provide financial assistance because often the people who are detained are the breadwinners of the family. So there is a significant loss of income. Um, There's always the post-detention support, helping people get to and from their immigration appointments. So there are a lot of different ways to get involved. I know CRSC has every so often kind of like an information session about their rapid response network. So you can go and learn more about what it is that they do specifically and where they're looking for help. I believe they're currently just on social media. I think they're on Facebook and Instagram. I'm not sure if they've developed a website yet, but you can also check them out through different organizations like Rise, which is a really great immigration nonprofit in Albany. If you get on their listserv, they'll often let folks know about different trainings that are coming up and those sorts of things.
If someone asks for an attorney, but they're on a very long waiting list, can they be deported while waiting?
So I'm not an immigration attorney, but I will try to answer that. So once the person is picked up, they're entitled to a hearing. And during that process, they're also entitled to request for bond. And obviously, a person has a right to an attorney, but that means that they have a right to hire an attorney. Unlike the criminal system, the immigration system is not one that you are, or the government provides you with an attorney. As a matter of fact, Obama and Biden had rules regarding minors, and those were taken away. We have hearings in which minors themselves, as young as 2 year olds, are attending these hearings without any legal representative. So you do have that right, and that's why it's important to organize prior to the occurrence of a raid. What happens in that process if you are waiting for an attorney? If you do have an attorney, then that attorney should be able to appear. But if you don't have an attorney, what they would often try to do is get you to waive your hearings and then deport yourself on what's called an expedited removal proceeding. That way you are bypassing the entire whatever's left of the legal structure within the immigration authorities, and then you yourselves are deciding to exit the United States voluntarily. That doesn't mean that you are allowed to walk out. It just means that you're on the next flight out, wherever that takes you. It could be on occasion, as we have seen recently, as places as far away, third countries as far away as Africa, that are receiving these people. And for the most part, these are individuals that may have been picked up because of, for example, a small infraction or in a raid, or as Haley suggested, someone was getting picked up and people ran. So again, it is extremely problematic what we have, but it is what it is, and we're trying to do our best in order to get informed.
Sorry, the chat is jumping on me.
Sorry, that was me. I was adding in some of the information
That's
for
okay.
New York for All and then also the action that's taking place tomorrow.
Yes, if folks want to look at the chat, Haley's provided a link to information on New York for All. We have a couple more questions. How can we help small religious communities made up of immigrants understand all of this?
I think this immigrant communities are aware of what's going on. I think it's mostly us that need to step up at this point. They have their own risk, and we try our best to reach them. I know Haley and others have been very active in communities, especially immigrant communities. Obviously, our trainings with them are a little bit different from what you have received today, because we also go into a little bit more of immigration consequences and helping them identify resources that could help them out. But there are people out there trying to help and reach the immigrant community. But I think that our purpose is also recognizing that this is a battle across sectors, and we need to get and recruit others, such as yourselves, into this war that we are experiencing at this point.
Um, Jan notes that the 5 Calls app can help you get in touch with your state reps. And then we have someone who remarks, I'm interested in helping, but I don't live in Albany or Albany County. I'm in Rensselaer. Is there a need over there? And if so, who would they contact? And Rensselaer is one of the counties that has an agreement with ICE, aren't they?
Absolutely. It has been, ICE have been quite active in Albany, Schenectady, Rensselaer, and Saratoga counties. So I would recommend reaching out to the Capital Region Sanctuary Coalition because they do work. There is a group in Rensselaer County, and I believe they work closely, but are in fact two separate groups. I am not sure who the contact information for Rensselaer is off the top of my head. But if you contact Capital Region Sanctuary Coalition, they should be able to put you in touch.
Yeah. Thank you. As I mentioned earlier, there's information in the chat on New York for All and on the training that's happening tomorrow. No Collusion, No Cages Advocacy Day. So there's a registration link for that. Oh, thank you. I'm going to give one last pass for questions. Does anyone have one last question for our presenters?
Thank you, Jen.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
One question about if a parent is picked up, what happens to the children? Is that where faith communities could step in and provide temporary shelter, or is there a requirement that social services be involved?
This would be a good time to consult an organization that develops family preparedness plans. There are a couple of different avenues that a parent can choose how their child would be taken care of. For them, it could be a community of faith. It could be somebody else who they know that lives in their area. So definitely recommend that they reach out to a nonprofit to develop a family preparedness plan. And there are like legal documents to authorize somebody else to take care of them. A family preparedness plan is a start in that direction.
Thank you. Diego and Haley, thank you so much. This has really been valuable, tremendous amount of information. Thank you so much. You've been so generous with your time.
Thank you.
Dave, is there
No, I don't think
any?
that's it. That's it. I think we're
Thank you.
done.
Thank you for the invitation and feel
Yeah.
free to reach out. Mary has my contact information and Haley's information. For all means, we just want to make sure that you guys understand that you're not alone and we're here to help. And more importantly, we need you.
Thank you.